I'm sure that I've recently been using this saying more often than I should, but it's because it also applies here, or maybe I just need to do more reading. With Trophy, what you see is what you get, and that's not a bad thing. Trophy is a NES-styled game that goes out of its way to be like Mega Man. It openly displays its influences, and that may come off as too much for some, but for others, it'll most likely scratch an itch that hasn't been scratched in a while. I know that others will enjoy it not only because I did, but also because I know that gamers can sometimes be like metalheads. The idea being that when they find something that they greatly enjoy, they'll go out of their way to find more like it, no matter if it's more or less a reskinned version of a classic. In the end, I took Trophy for what it was. Unsurprisingly, seeing as how this is a NES/Mega Man styled game, jumping is of great importance in Trophy. Simply put, the jumping is both good and bad. It's great how much control you have over the jump, but at the same time, it feels like too much control. What I mean is that you can control it in ways that's not possible in other games, but at the same time, it's weird that depending on how you utilize it, at times it's closer to a floating mechanic. A slight moment of floating helps with large gaps or intricate/challenging platforming sections. On the bright side, being able to release your jump helped avoid incoming enemy fire. I also encountered situations where I had to figure out where and how precise I needed to jump to get to where I needed to go while avoiding insta-kill obstacles. As funny as it may sound, having to remember the exact spot to jump from and knowing which particular way to jump in order to avoid falling or being hit by an enemy is stressful. If anything, this showcases the attention to detail that went into the jumping mechanic, and it shows the skill of the devs involved. Despite having played almost all of the classic Mega Man games, the truth is that I've beaten very few of them. It's because I grew up during the late 90s/early 2000s, and I never owned a NES or SNES. Still, from what I've experienced of the classic Mega Man games, I feel like they exist to punish you. Some would disagree with me, and I'm fine with that, mainly because it's possible to beat the games, but that's what came to mind as I was playing Trophy. The fact that I could choose any of the levels to start from was a great idea because it allowed me to go with what I most felt comfortable with. Initially, I felt that the Carnival level was more forgiving. At the same time, it was much longer than the ones I'd initially tried. What made Trophy difficult was that the enemies would quickly pile up against you. This would happen if you went back into an area instead of advancing ahead. Most of the time it was to avoid an incoming enemy, but other times it just happened. As a result of that, enemies that you just defeated would respawn, and you'd still have to deal with enemies that were coming from further in the level. It's not as if the enemies would come no matter what, seeing as how your movement was really what controlled when and where the enemies would appear, but it would still happen. Early on in the game, this left me feeling smothered, and it was a bit of a while before I got used to this. This, along with having to restart levels from the beginning after a certain point and difficult bosses, left me thinking that while I could beat this game, it'd for sure be hard, and it'd take me a while to get through. I eventually came to the conclusion that learning from my failures was the best way to approach Trophy. That helped motivate me, but sometimes I'd run out of patience due to how difficult I found the game to be. It helped that once you'd reach a certain point in levels, you could continue from there, but that still didn't change that you'd have to restart from the beginning of a level once your lives were depleted, or that there were still difficult obstacles to overcome. The obstacles weren't always literal ones such as insta-kill objects or difficult enemies. Due to having to begin a level from the beginning so many times, traveling from the start to the boss got to be tedious. As I said, learning from my failures helped so that I could know when to speed things up and when to be more cautious, but the number of times I had to repeat certain levels or sections made it so that it was as if I were running through mud. What's funny is that there are two distinct periods of time when I played through Trophy. The first time was when I first got a key for it, but after a while I felt that it was too much for me, so I decided to move on. The second time was more recently. It's possible that I got better, I just got accustomed to how Trophy works, but the second time around I progressed like never before. It was still hard, but not to the point where I was previously left thinking, this game's too much for me. Being able to reach new heights not only helped motivate me to keep trying, but being able to have passwords to continue from a later point was also incredibly useful. Knowing how some older gamers/diehard retro fans are, they'd bring up a game that forces you to go from beginning to end with no continues or passwords as being harder than Trophy, but that doesn't change how I feel. Overcoming the levels was one thing, but trying to do the same with the bosses was just more to pile on. At times I'd say that some bosses were easier than a few of the levels, but there were also some that got me close to wanting to rage quit. Some bosses had way more health than others, so that made the fights last a while. That was difficult to deal with because I was stressed about not dying and trying to figure out the best way to beat a boss. When you add that to a 10-minute boss fight, it's easy to understand why at one point I moved on from Trophy. You could say that modern games influenced by the classics have spoiled me. At one point I was left thinking that I would have liked to have known how close I was to beating a boss. Early on, there was one in particular that really pissed me off. It could just be that I'm not the pro gamer I like to think I am. That's a joke. Or the boss had too much space to work with when it came to damaging you. There was this boss with a magnet that would draw you in even if you were noticeably far away from it. I know that it was possible to avoid this, seeing as how I did beat this boss, but I was forced to constantly stay alert and rush towards the other side of the screen when I saw this move starting to happen. This got to me because I knew how to beat this boss, but actually doing it was the hard part. That leaves me wondering what's worse, not knowing how to beat a boss, or knowing how you're supposed to beat it, and yet still failing to do so. You could say that was my experience with Trophy in a nutshell. Despite at one point thinking that Trophy was too much for me and deciding to move on from it, I eventually made it to the final boss. I don't know how much time I spent trying to beat it, but I got to the point where I decided it was too much for me. There was a moment when I figured I was better off just writing a first impressions video since I hadn't beaten the game, but I eventually decided that I wanted to see the end credits, even if I had to use cheats to accomplish that. Not only did I use cheats, I figured out how to make the game work in my favor. It was during the last level that I realized that I could overcome difficult sections by straight up jumping off screen. Not only that, there were certain sections where I could grind for as long as I wanted to hoard extra lives. This was especially helpful during my countless number of attempts against the final boss. All of that and the cheats I found online helped, but that still didn't change how difficult it was to actually beat the final boss. The day I managed to do so, it took me around 3 hours. Some will say that I didn't actually beat the game, but seeing as how I used what were tricks/cheats from the game itself, I'm fine with how I did manage to beat Trophy. The fact that there were a handful of play sessions where I played for 2 hours or more straight goes to show that Trophy clicked with me. At one point I gave up on it, but the fact that I came back for more and got around 10 hours of playtime speaks volumes about Trophy. While I do recommend it, I wouldn't go so far as to say that everyone will enjoy it. Not only because it's a retro-styled game, but also because it's a hard game that requires a lot of effort to go through. I know that there are retro junkies out there that crave this kind of game, so if you fit into that niche group, I'd say have at it. If you prefer something more manageable/straightforward, chances are that Trophy isn't for you. How do you feel about using cheats to beat a game? What are your thoughts in regards to games that openly showcase their influences? Have there been any games that you straight up abandoned due to being too difficult or just not for you? If you enjoyed this content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching.